over the last 6 years, we have expanded tremendously in the field of fire compliance, supporting the industry and the region in getting a better understanding of fire on cladding. We have a slew of equipment ranging from small-scale equipment to test reaction to fire characteristics of materials, as well as probably the only lab in the world which can offer a test as per the British and the American standard for the large-scale fire propagation tests. We also have a total of 4 fire resistance furnaces now. So apart from the standard 3 meter by 3 meter furnace, we now also have a 4 meter by 5 meter vertical and a 4 meter by 5 meter horizontal furnace, both load bearing furnaces. And it is an interesting set of capability to have. And we are very glad that we've been able to service the industry. A lot of us have been following this webinar series. So today's session is going to be slightly interesting and a different tact. While we continue to talk about fire compliance and specifically passive fire protection, I talk about a subject which is very close to me. I often talk about liability, and we understand that liability and compliance are very, very related. But today's session is very specific to the commercial implication or aspects related to fire safety and misimplementation of compliance. I'm going to start with the definition of what is profit leakage, in case you have heard the term. This is a very interesting concept I learned about 18 years ago. I used to work for a company called Larsen & Toubro, LNT. A lot of you would be familiar with the company. I was part of a commercial team, and one of the projects that we were handling, we had a government client, and we had a project value of about 100 million rupees, which is about 27 million US dollars. And it was quite a difficult project to get. It was a hard negotiation with the government. As always, government would hold their purse strings very tightly. And as one of my students got the contract in place, that we realized as part of the bid that the subcontract value, or the amount of contract pricing, the subcontract value was about 20 million rupees. And if people are familiar with the fact that in India, there have been traditionally a lot of taxes internally. So the 20 million worth subcontract of the value of the contract had to be taxed, and was taxed because moving material across states for getting job work done from subcontractors ended up in a fair amount of tax. And the result was that there was a tax of approximately 9% as an average, which resulted in about 2% of the value of the whole contract. So some of you who have answered the question to begin with, that what is a possible profit in a large contract? Well, you can notice that this amount, which the contract allowed us, that we could go back to the government and take this money back, was avoiding profit leakage. And I was tasked with the activity to get this money for the company. So I had to sift through an extremely large number of invoices and bills and claim the money back. Point being that in large contracts, small clauses often have the capacity and the capability to bring about a massive amount of difference in the profit of the company. We all know that another very important part is maintaining the legal sanctity of the contract. Often we know that if any contract gets into legal wrangles, the amount of money and the time that needs to be spent to make sure that we have not broken the law, or to prove that the contract has not broken the law, can sap away a huge amount of money, and hence profit leaks away. So while a lot of you are familiar with the UAE and the UAE's Fire and Life Safety Code of Practice, you would be aware that the moment this Fire and Life Safety Code was published, a parallel law was passed which enabled and empowered the civil defense and various government entities to use and have the law use the code. Again, the code, when it was revised in 2018, and the chapter 18, which is the roles and responsibilities chapter, was added, again, there was the law that was revised, and it empowered the civil defense and many other authorities and bodies to push through the sections of the code and maybe ask for a fine and so on and so forth. So as we delve deeper to understand the implications of how law, specifications, and contracts meet, and to make sure that the contract is able to deliver a profitable result for the company, let us understand how all of these things are worded between two companies entering into a contract. Technical specifications and commercial contracts are usually the two documents that can define the relationship. Let's understand how compliance is usually talked about. Many of you are familiar with standards and codes which are referred. Let us delve a little deeper to understand how these documents, technical documents, are empowered. Code of practice, many of you, as an example, are familiar with the UAE Fire and Life Safety Code of Practice. A code of practice is a recommended sound good practice as currently undertaken by competent and conscientious practitioners. What this means is that it is a recommendation based on the general learnings that the industry has had. This means that how effective it is and how flexible it is known and can be interpreted case to case basis. It is important to understand that codes of practice are guideline documents. They need not be set in stone. They have some amount of flexibility as they are implemented from project to project. Moving on, another type of standard which is used, which we often call as methods or standard methods. As an example, the NFPA 285, which is a standard fire test method for the evaluation of fire propagation characteristics of exterior wall assemblies containing combustible components. Now, these test methods are highly prescriptive documents. They set out an agreed way of measuring, testing, specifying, and what is reliably repeatable across different circumstances and places. What this means is that these documents, whenever they are referred, they are very rigid. They talk about repeatability, whether they are repeatability of how a test result would come out or how an installation is done, etc. These methods or standards have very, very little scope and flexibility. And hence, when these are used in specifications and contracts, they almost set things in stone in a binary fashion, 0 or 1, pass or fail. Another type of standards are guides. As an example, some of you familiar with the testing world are aware about ISO 17025. This is a guide document which sets across general requirements for the competence of testing and calibration laboratories. Now, guides are published to give less prescriptive advice. They give a general advice on what are the kind of things that should be captured. They do not go into details of how they should be captured. Another classic example of a guide is the ISO 9001 standard, which is a guide document. Here again, it means that there is a higher degree of flexibility as compared to codes. They define how generally things should be done, but do not end up specifying the whys and hows of it. Why is it important to know these things? Well, in the world that we live in is an open world where trade is something that has been the backbone of growth and commerce across the world. What this leads to is it leads to potentially complex supply chains. We are constantly assessing to buy new products and services. And over the last few decades, various constructs or concepts have evolved to provide a very high degree of assurance between the buyer and the seller. The ISO 9001 standard is a test or is a standard, which is a guide document. A lot of you would already be familiar with this or might have heard about this as a management system certification. What this standard does is it provides some amount of confidence between the buyer and the seller that the seller or the buyer follows certain practices which lead to a structured approach of delivering a product or a service. This is a standard that was the claim to fame for ISO as one of the rare publications that was almost adopted across the world. And it created a path for people who were buying and sourcing products and materials across very large distances, across countries, and it provided certain level of assurance between the buyer and the seller. But when it came to buying materials and products, this was something that was not sufficient. It only defined that certain practices are followed. Incoming quality assurance method is in place, as an example. How sales are booked, how books of account are maintained, what is the minimum level of information that needs to be captured. These were examples of some of the things that ISO 9001 companies who were certified needed to have a process in place. But this could not provide the assurance related to the performance of products and materials that are procured. And this is where testing laboratories and test reports came in. As you may recall, test methods can be very binary, can be very black and white. And test methods provide a very high level of assurance that when you pick up a sample of a product and you test it, it either complies or does not comply with the performance that has been the basis of the contract in several cases. Whether you are testing a bottle of milk picked up from the store, or you are testing a door for fire resistance capability, the test methods and the laboratories which are accredited to conduct these tests are done to demonstrate repeatability of tests. But two things were a problem. One, you could not test everything everywhere. Some tests were very, very expensive. As an example, some fire tests can be very expensive. And if I go back to some of the tests that I have sold in my life, tests related to, let's say, medium voltage, high voltage products. There are some short circuit tests where tests are used to validate the endurance of large scale equipment like transformers, whether they can endure 50,000 or 100,000 amperes of current in a millisecond. So you can imagine that you spend maybe close to 10 million Indian rupees in a few seconds for a pass or a fail. This is the kind of money that was not always possible to spend when procurement is being done. Another challenge that came, and is a very valid challenge, is that a test report is only a record of how a given sample performed, and it may or may not relate with what is being supplied or what will be supplied. To overcome this limitation, the construct of certification and listing evolved over the years. Herein, the third-party independent certification body followed a guide document to create a process, the guide document being the ISO 17065 guidance standard. And they followed one among several processes to ensure and say that a given product carrying a given certification mark or given traceability mark will comply to performance or certain tests that have passed. And this is where product certification as a construct has evolved and has been evolving over the years. Across countries, across economies, there are certain products which are regulated. These products require mandatory compliance requirements, products which are very, very important to health and safety in life. You would notice electrical safety products, medical products, food products are governed by regulations, and one or more type of certification method is mandated by a certain government authority. People in UAE are very familiar with the civil defense approval, and a small picture that you can see under the way forward arrow shows how certification and listing, which is used as a minimum requirement to get a product registered and to allow you to sell the product in the UAE, which is related to fire and life safety. Let's take an example. If you are procuring a fire door, as a pre-qualification to understand how the company is and whether they are professional enough and they are able to come across and demonstrate repeatability, you would notice that you can probably ask for an ISO 9001 certificate. Maybe you'll ask for a test report. What the test report will tell you is that how a given sample, which was installed in the laboratory, complied or did not comply to a fire resistance test. Now, it is important that if you use a fire test as a prerequisite, as a document where you use the test report to say whether I will buy or not buy the product, you must know and understand that the laboratory who is releasing the test report should be accredited and should know how to conduct a given test. A few days ago, I was speaking to a facade consultant for a given project, and he mentioned that he has a copy of a reaction to fire test, a BS test, BS 476 part 5 or 6. And he said that he got a report from a laboratory which seems to be from Abu Dhabi. And I asked him who the laboratory is, because as far as I knew, and I track competition, there is no such laboratory. And this is where I impressed upon the consultant to know and understand and check, is the test report a real report? Is it from an accredited laboratory? It will be good to know. So here again, as explained, a best known method, which is certification and listing, is a method that is commonly used to have a much higher level of assurance, because a certificate or a certification and listing as a tool also adds in traceability. Listing or certification and listing as a construct allows buyers to look up a certification mark and check whether the products, materials procured, ready to be installed, are actually complying to the standards. And there is a third-party body who will provide this assurance using the certification mark as a scheme. And this is something I will explain. How certification schemes work, you can see this small table at the top. There are many different methods by which certification can be conducted. You may be familiar with the fact that products to be placed in Saudi Arabia, for example, call for a SASO certification, which means that SASO as a body will certify a product based on verification of test reports. Now, there are different methods by which certification schemes are designed and run. I remember interacting with a certification body from a given country who maintained two separate certification schemes. One scheme was run specifically for products which they certified but were to be sold in their country alone. And they had maintained a very similar looking certification scheme or certification process for products which need not necessarily be sold in that country, but wanted a certification mark from the given certification body. The two schemes were very different in intensity of verification. The scheme which was used outside the country did not mandate the verification or sampling, which means it did not mandate or require that a traceability between what is tested and what is being manufactured. And hence, it was an easier form of certification. The UAE Fire and Life Safety Code of Practice, as an example, understood these differences very, very well. People who are familiar with this know that the UAE Fire and Life Safety Code of Practice actually specifies the Type 5 certification as a certification requirement in the country. And the Type 5 certification method is very, very detailed and calls for assuring that there is sampling and traceability between what is tested and what is manufactured. With this as a background and with an understanding of what are the different types of tools or standards, methods, guides, codes that are used, let us take a peek into some of the specifications that we see. These specification documents are almost the order or procurement order defining what product or what service is being purchased. I'll read out some and try and explain what a normal seller would read these specifications as. I'll read out. For applications indicated, use materials complying with requirements in this article that are acceptable to authorities having jurisdiction and comply with testing requirements, testing by a qualified testing agency. Here and nowhere else in this document is it defined what is a qualified testing agency and what does it mean to comply with testing requirements. Again, I will read another line which says, fire retardant treated lumber and plywood by pressure process. Products with a flame spread index of 25 or less when tested according to ASTM 84. People in the testing business like I would tell everybody that a standard like ASTM 84 gets revised almost 2 times a year sometimes. So which year is to be referred? And is there any link between the test report and what will be supplied to the project? What is the kind of testing laboratory? Are they supposed to be accredited? There are several details which, when missed out, provide the small exit doors for people to run away from things. I will read a section of another one, which talks about certification and listing, which is actually very, very good. But again, if you read the line for units exceeding the sizes of tested assemblies, provides certification by a qualified testing agency. Again, there is no definition of how a testing agency is being qualified, and there is no clear definition of what it means by saying provide certification. What kind of certification evidence exists? And when you do get a certification evidence, how can you use it? I'll give you an example. Some of you might have seen this video. How do you really look up the evidence? Somebody would typically give you a certificate or maybe a certification number, and you should be able to look up this certificate number, validate whether the certificate or the certification document that has been given is real or not. But it doesn't end there. The documentation goes on to explain a lot of details which are important for an inspector, inspection agency, or even someone who is a procurer of materials to cross-check and cross-verify what the material is and how it is received at the site. This certificate is an example of a fire-rated door, but it is not just us as Thomas Bell-Wright who are providing this certification. Anybody who is offering a certification and listing, here are examples of certification directories from UL, Intertek, and even TUV. All products which are certified and listed need to carry a certification mark, a number, which can be traced back at the site, at the point where the product is procured and used. It is important to understand these specifics. It is important to be able to use these specifics when you are writing specifications, procurement documents, and even commercial clauses in a contract. The UAE Civil Defense, for example, would define that these details need to be submitted as minimum details from the consultant. This would, as an example, just limit to what the compliance requirements are. But it is up to the procurer, or contractor, or consultant to go deeper and explain how these compliance requirements can be checked, need to be checked. I will give another example. This is, I picked up from the website of this company who had some pictures of a project that they had done. Now, an aluminum composite panel, when certified, let's say by us, would have a certification number for the purpose of traceability. This protective film, which actually comes off, goes away. But the back of the aluminum composite panel here would have the certification number. This certification number can be and should be looked up at the certification directory, and a certificate should be looked up and seen. This is what provides the inspector, the inspection body, the tools to verify not only what the product has reached the site, but an inspection body, a facility management company, or someone who is investigating a claim, someone who may be insuring the building, who wants to go and look at the aluminum composite panel as it is installed on the construction site. These are the traceability numbers which need to be there, which are there, and should be used effectively. How should these be used effectively? Let's take another example of a specification document. This is where potentially you could write something that helps you bring about an extremely good fire compliance requirements, or you could bring about something that causes confusion and causes lots and lots of delay. I will read out. This is fire resistance requirements. And very interesting, this is fire resistance requirement for cladding material. And it says that performance of panels and fire resistant assemblies under fire or high temperature exposure or shall be as follows and meeting the recent civil defense requirements. To meet time rating indicated on the drawings and specifications as verified by a recognized certification, comma, or 45? Very unclear. I couldn't figure out what it meant. And as you read through, it is simply surprising that a document like this is out, is used, and it leads to clarity or non-clarity. It leads to effective implementation of fire and life safety strategy. It is scary sometimes. So I will read on. Has been tested and can be certified to meet these requirements, which means a product has been tested by somebody in the past without defining what is the kind of test evidence that is, and can be certified, which means there is no mandate that has been set that it should be certified and how it should be certified, what should be the requirements, and so on and so forth. These kind of documents are or can be make or break for contractors. These are the kind of documents that can lead to a project seemingly profitable go in red, a project that was acquired thinking that this will be the feather in the cap, a prestigious project which can be claimed by a contractor or a material supplier to be part of, but something that cost massive losses. So what should be there in the specifications? There needs to be a clarity of reference. As an example, if you are referring listing, you need to refer it in clear details. As an example, submit certification and listing evidence from an ISO 17065 accredited certification body and recognized by local AHJ if required, that can be used to identify what the products are at site. And the specification, for example, if it is for fire doors, can go on to detail the requirements and needs for fire door labels. Responsibility. The specification document should define the responsibility. As an example, the contractor needs to submit evidence of certification and listing along with inspection reports as part of the document submission dossier. Who is responsible? What are the responsibilities? If clearly defined, will lead to prevention, in my opinion, of profit leakage. A profit that can leak because of a liability that will be introduced, can be introduced, would be introduced. Moving on, documentation as an example. Evidence submitted should be verifiable on public listing directories. In case the inspection liability of the contract is being transferred to an inspection agency, copies of their 17 or 20 or 17 or 24, these are guides which define how inspection bodies should operate or inspectors should operate, along with the professional indemnity insurance should be submitted. Documentation should define what is listing reports, if there is requirement of accreditation, qualification, etc. And then my favorite part, the linkage with the commercial clauses. Whenever you specify certain clauses in the technical specifications that are clear, you should be able to link these with commercial clauses to bring about the importance, the sanctity of these requirements. Because these requirements, which have been clearly defined, specifically related to quality assurance and procurement, these are the requirements which will ensure that the profitability is maintained. It will ensure that there is no potential future liability that will get created. If it is getting created, it will be covered in monetary terms. So you can link these requirements with stage payments, with performance guarantees, and even penalties. In summary, this is the last slide, and I will open the floor for questions. And before I open the floor for questions, I would open a small poll for everybody, if this allows. But otherwise, while I open the board, please feel free to write in questions in the chat comment, and I will be happy to take the questions and answer the questions. Everybody, I'm sorry there has been some technical problem and I had to restart, but I will be eagerly looking forward to questions coming from the audience, which I can reply. I'm opening a poll question as well. Look forward to the audience answering this poll question. Please keep pouring the questions. I see some questions are already coming in. And while you answer the poll, which is open for you to answer, I will wait for other questions. And as the poll ends, I'm going to start answering the questions coming in. I hope you have found the insights interesting. One of the questions in the current poll/quiz is that in case any of the listeners would be keen or interested to know or need any help or guidance in writing any of these specifications, technical specifications where compliance is something that is referred to, I would be happy to help. I'm going to send out an email to everybody who has marked the question 4 as yes, and I would be available for a chat about this. I'm going to answer the question in a minute, but if there is any other question that's coming in, please feel free to write these questions in the chat box. So with less than a minute left, I encourage everybody to answer the questions or the poll or the quiz. And I am going to take on the question, which is very, very interesting. This question comes very, very often. What should we do if the certificate is fake? And what are the consequences that should be faced by the manufacturer? This is a great question, obviously, and it all depends on two things. One, which jurisdiction you are in. And in any case, what is the contract between the buyer and the seller? And it's very simple. I would give an example that if you want to go and buy a cell phone and you go to a reseller and you buy an Apple iPhone and you come back home after paying the money and you realize that the Apple iPhone was a fake, what would you do? You can go to the police and say that what I was told is wrong. And depending on the legal system in the country you are in is where and how a fake certificate, a fake product is dealt with. It is an offense, it is an economic offense, and the offense and the depth of the offense varies as per the implication. So if there is a fake certificate which was used to supply a product which led to the loss of life, which led to a building falling down, it is something that can be taken up, should be taken up, and often is taken up in many countries. I hope that answers your question. But each stakeholder between the buyer, the seller, and the certificate provider are available, and they can be taken to task, taken to court, taken to the local judiciary system, etc. I'll wait for a few more minutes if there is any other question. If not, you have my contact details, and you are invited to copy down the email address, sfpeuae@gmail.com, for anyone who is keen and eager to get the PDH certificate or the Professional Development Hour certificate for today's webinar session. This webinar series has been very, very interesting. The last in the 9-part webinar series is scheduled for 3 weeks from now. The registrations are open. The next and the last topic in this series is related to fire stopping. And I would welcome you and your friends, people you think who would be interested to learn more about compliance and how compliance is implemented for fire stopping. You are most welcome to register yourself for the next webinar. I'll wait for a few more minutes in case you have any questions related to compliance, how compliance needs to be correctly specified, compliance needs to be specifically worded. I will be happy to take on questions. So then I will end today's webinar session. I thank you all for joining in today. If there are any questions that you would like to send an email or write to us, I would be happy to take on and have a one-to-one chat with anybody. Thank you very, very much for joining in today. I hope the session was useful and interesting, and I look forward to connecting with all of you in the near future. Thank you very much, and bye-bye for today.